I can strike him out in 3 pitches." The words landed clean, sharp, and out of place against the roar of a packed stadium that held over 40,000 people, the kind of place where dreams were measured in miles per hour and contracts were written in 8-figure ink. And for half a second, nobody reacted, like the sound itself hadn't fully registered yet, like it didn't belong in a space reserved for scouts in tailored polos and players with highlight reels already playing on national television. But then the reaction came all at once, a ripple turning into a wave, laughter spilling from the stands, low at first, then louder, then uncontrollable, bouncing off the metal bleachers and echoing beneath the bright white floodlights that washed the field in a sterile glow. And Malik Johnson didn't move. Not when the man 2 rows behind the dugout shook his head and said something under his breath. Not when a group of college recruiters exchanged amused looks. Not even when one of the assistant coaches let out a short chuckle he tried, and failed, to hide, because Malik had already said what he came to say, and now all that was left was the silence inside him, the kind that didn't break under pressure but settled, steady and grounded, like cleats digging into packed dirt, his fingers tightening slightly around the worn leather of his glove, the stitching rough against his skin, familiar, real, something that didn't laugh back at him. And across the field, Logan Pierce adjusted his batting gloves with the easy confidence of someone who had never once had to prove he belonged. 6'2", broad shoulders, the kind of player scouts circled before the first pitch was even thrown, the kind of player people expected to dominate and expected to win. And Malik could feel the contrast without needing to look at it directly, could feel it in the way people leaned toward Logan and away from him, in the way the air seemed to bend around expectation, in the way Coach Daniel Whitaker stood just a few feet away, arms crossed tight against his chest, jaw set, eyes locked somewhere just past Malik like he was already moving on, already deciding this moment didn't matter. "You done?" the coach asked, his voice even but edged with something colder than irritation, something closer to dismissal, and Malik looked up, not defiant, not loud, just clear. "I just need 3 pitches, sir," he said. And the word sir wasn't submission, it was control, it was discipline, it was the way his father had taught him to speak when the world didn't want to listen. And for a second, just one, the noise dipped again, not silence, not yet, but something thinner, like the crowd was waiting to see how far this would go. And the scoreboard above flickered with numbers that didn't include his name. Not yet, the inning frozen. Pass on its own. But it did not. Because Malik did not step back and he did not repeat himself, he simply stood there with that same quiet steadiness, glove hanging at his side, shoulders relaxed but grounded, and the crowd, sensing hesitation, began to shift again, the laughter thinning into murmurs, into scattered comments that drifted down like static. "This is not a tryout," someone called out. "Kid thinks this is a movie," another voice added, and somewhere behind the dugout a scout scribbled something in a notebook without even looking up, already dismissing what had not yet happened. And across the field Logan Pierce rolled his shoulders once and glanced toward the mound, his expression somewhere between curiosity and mild annoyance, like he was being asked to entertain something beneath his level. And that look, that small flicker of assumption, passed over Malik without sticking, because he had seen it before, in smaller parks, in empty lots, in places where no one kept score except the people who refused to forget. 3 pitches, Malik said again, not louder, not sharper, just the same. And that was what made it land. Not force, not challenge, but consistency, like a metronome no one could interrupt. And Coach Whitaker finally shifted, just slightly, uncrossing one arm, then the other, his hand brushing against the lineup card tucked into his back pocket, a gesture that felt more like habit than decision. But something in his face had changed, not softened, not yet, but cracked just enough to let doubt in. And he exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing toward Malik as if trying to find the flaw, the hesitation, the reason to say no and move on. But there was none, just a kid standing in a place he was not supposed to stand, asking for less than a minute of time, and somehow that made it harder to refuse. "This is not a showcase," the coach said finally, his voice carrying just enough to reach the front rows, controlled but firm. "We are in the middle of a game that matters." And Malik nodded once, quick, respectful. "Yes, sir," he said. And then, after a beat, "That is why I am asking. And that line, simple as it was, slipped through the noise like a clean pitch through open air, and for a moment the coach did not respond, because the logic was uncomfortable, because it forced the question he had been avoiding. What if the kid was not wrong, and the scoreboard above them blinked again? The inning still paused, the weight of a game valued in numbers too large to ignore hanging quietly over everything. And from the edge of the field an official stepped closer, speaking low to the coach, a reminder, a warning, something about keeping things on schedule, about expectations, about optics, words that belonged to contracts and sponsors, and everything that made this field more than just dirt and chalk. And Coach Whitaker listened, nodded once, then looked back at Malik. And this time he did not look past him, he looked directly at him, measuring, calculating, and the stadium seemed to lean in with him. The murmurs tightening into something sharper, anticipation replacing amusement, not because they believed, not yet, but because they sensed the possibility of something unexpected, and that was always enough to hold attention. And Malik felt it, the shift in the air, the way the space around him changed when people stopped laughing and started watching, and his fingers flexed once inside his glove, the leather creasing softly, grounding him again, steadying the rhythm in his chest. And somewhere in the stands a vendor called out for cold drinks, the ordinary sound cutting through the tension in a way that made everything feel even more real. And then Coach Whitaker took a step back, just one, but it opened the path, subtle but unmistakable, and he gestured toward the mound, not dramatically, not with approval, but with something closer to reluctant permission. "You get 3, he said, and the words landed heavier than they should have, because they were not just about pitches. They were about risk, about reputation, about everything that could go wrong in less than 30 seconds, and Malik did not smile, did not celebrate. He just nodded once more and walked forward. Each step measured, the dirt crunching softly beneath his cleats, and as he reached the mound, the field seemed to quiet in a way that no one had planned, the kind of quiet that comes not from silence but from focus. And Malik placed his foot against the rubber, looking out toward home plate, toward Logan Pierce, toward everything that had already decided who would win, and for the first time since he spoke, the stadium did not laugh at him, it waited. Malik Johnson stood on the mound, and for a brief moment the world narrowed into something smaller than the stadium, smaller than the crowd, smaller than the weight of the game itself. It narrowed into 60 feet and 6 inches, the exact distance between where he stood and where Logan Pierce waited, bat resting lightly against his shoulder. And that distance felt familiar, not intimidating, not impossible, just precise, like something he had measured 1,000 times in places where no one kept track except him. And he rolled the ball once in his hand, feeling the seams press into his fingertips, aligning them without looking, muscle memory guiding him the way it always had. And behind the plate the catcher shifted, clearly unsure, glancing once toward Coach Whitaker as if expecting this to be stopped at the last second. But no signal came. No interruption, just the quiet permission that had already been given. And the umpire, after a slight hesitation, stepped into position, his voice low but clear as he called the field back into order. And the crowd leaned forward collectively, not cheering, not laughing, just watching now. Because something about the stillness had changed the rules, and Malik inhaled slowly, the air cool in his chest. And as he exhaled he brought his hands together in front of him, glove meeting ball with a soft, controlled sound that barely carried beyond the mound. And for a fraction of a second his eyes closed, not in hesitation, but in recall. Because in that darkness there was no stadium, no pressure, just a smaller field under dim lights, a chain-link fence rattling in the wind, and his father's voice steady beside him, not loud, never loud, just clear, "Do not throw fast, throw true." And Malik opened his eyes again, and the stadium returned, but the noise did not, because he carried that stillness with him. And Logan Pierce shifted his stance slightly, tapping the plate once, twice, settling in with the confidence of someone who expected the moment to unfold exactly as it always had, easy, predictable, already decided. And Malik set his feet against the rubber, toes digging in just enough to feel the ground push back, anchoring him. And he looked up, not at the crowd, not at the coach, just at the catcher's glove, the small target suspended in space, and everything else fell away. And then he moved, smooth, controlled, no rush. His arm coming forward in one continuous motion that did not strain or force, but followed through with quiet precision. And the ball left his hand without drama, without excess. Just a clean release that cut through the air with a soft, almost invisible speed. And for a split second it seemed slower than expected, like it might drift. Like it might give Logan time to adjust, and Logan did. Move, his bat coming forward in a confident arc, timing what he assumed was an easy read. But the ball did not stay where it seemed to be. It dipped just slightly, a subtle shift that changed everything in the last 10 feet, and the bat passed through empty space, a fraction too high, a fraction too early, and the sound that followed was not the crack everyone anticipated but a quiet, sharp pop as the ball settled cleanly into the catcher's glove. And that sound echoed louder than it should have, because of what did not come with it. No cheers, no laughter, just a sudden, collective pause. And the umpire straightened slightly, his voice cutting through the silence. Strike. And it was a simple word, routine, spoken thousands of times before, but here it landed differently. Heavier, because it did not fit the expectation that had been set just moments earlier. And Logan blinked once, resetting his stance quickly, dismissing it, because one pitch meant nothing, because one moment could always be explained away. But in the stands the shift was already happening, subtle but undeniable, the murmurs returning but softer now, edged with something new, not amusement but curiosity, and Coach Whitaker did not speak, did not react outwardly, but his posture changed, just slightly, his weight shifting forward, attention no longer divided, no longer looking past Malik but fixed on him. And Malik stepped back off the mound for a brief second, rolling his shoulder once, not in strain but in rhythm, resetting. And his face did not change, no smile, no reaction, just the same calm focus he had carried from the start. Because to him the first pitch was not a surprise, it was confirmation, and as he stepped forward again, bringing his hands together once more, the stadium held its breath in a way it had not done for him before, not because they believed yet, but because they no longer knew what to expect. The word strike still lingered in the air, not loud but undeniable, and Logan Pierce exhaled through his nose, a controlled release that carried more irritation than concern, because players like him were not shaken by a single pitch, not in front of scouts, not in front of a crowd this size. And he reset his grip on the bat, tightening his gloves with a quick pull, eyes narrowing now as he looked out toward Malik with a little more focus, a little less assumption, and behind the plate the catcher shifted again, this time lower, more deliberate, glove angled slightly to the outside corner, as if testing whether that first pitch had been luck or something else entirely. And Malik saw it. Not just the position of the glove but the question behind it. And he did not rush. He stepped back onto the rubber with the same calm rhythm, heels settling, toes pressing in, grounding himself in the same patch of dirt that now felt different. Not because it had changed, but because the moment had. And the stadium followed that change. The noise still present, but quieter now. Like it was being held back. Like people were choosing not to interrupt what might be happening. And Coach Whitaker leaned forward just slightly. His arms no longer crossed. His attention fixed in a way that was no longer dismissive but cautious, calculating. And Malik brought his hands together again. Glove and ball meeting softly, his fingers adjusting along the seams with practiced precision, and for a brief second his gaze dropped, not in doubt but in memory, the echo of a voice that had guided him long before any of this mattered. Control the edges, not the center. And he lifted his eyes again, locking onto the catcher's glove, now set low and outside, a smaller target, a riskier one, and he began his motion, smooth, unforced, the kind that did not draw attention to itself but delivered exactly what it needed to. His arm coming forward in a clean arc, release point consistent, and the ball left. His hand with the same quiet intent as before, not overpowering, not wild, just precise, and Logan watched it closely this time, tracking it with sharper focus, waiting, adjusting, his bat starting forward just a fraction later than before, correcting for what he thought he had seen. But again the ball did not behave the way expectation demanded. It held its line just long enough to invite the swing and then drifted further outside, just beyond the reach of comfortable contact, and Logan extended, trying to meet it, but the angle was off, the timing just a hair behind, and the bat sliced through air again, missing clean, and the sound that followed was that same tight, unmistakable pop as the catcher secured it firmly in his glove. And this time the silence that followed was deeper, heavier, because it was no longer about surprise. It was about pattern, and the umpire's voice came again, steady, clear, strike. And 2 pitches in, the word carried weight now, not routine, but meaningful, and Logan stepped back from the plate for a second, adjusting his stance, rolling his shoulders as if to shake off something that had not happened before, his confidence. Still there, but now tempered with awareness, because this was no longer something to dismiss. And in the stands the murmurs shifted again, quieter still, more focused, people leaning forward, some lowering their phones as if they realized they might be witnessing something they had not expected to record. And Coach Whitaker's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes locked on Malik in a way that suggested recalculation, not just of the moment, but of everything that had led to it. And Malik stepped off the mound once more, not hurried, not dramatic, just resetting, his breathing steady, his grip relaxed but firm, and there was no celebration in him, no reaction to the strikes, because for him this was not a surprise, it was execution, it was the result of hours that no one had seen. And as he turned back toward the rubber, the field seemed to hold a different kind of quiet, one that no longer questioned why he was there, but what he would do next. And Malik placed his foot down again, aligning himself with the plate, bringing his hands together one more time. And now even the smallest sound stood out, the faint rustle of jerseys, the distant hum of the lights, the soft scrape of cleats in the batter's box. And Logan settled in again, tighter this time, more alert, his eyes locked in, knowing that the next pitch mattered in a way he had not expected just moments ago. And Malik looked up, steady, focused, the target waiting. And for the first time since he spoke those words, the entire stadium understood exactly what was at stake. Malik Johnson did not rush the third pitch, and that was what made it different, not slower in time, but deeper in intention, because now the moment was no longer about proving he could throw strikes. It was about choosing how, and that choice carried weight. And he stood on the mound with the ball resting quietly in his palm, fingers tracing the seams with a familiarity that came from repetition no one had witnessed. And the stadium held its breath in a way that felt almost unnatural. 40,000 people suspended between expectation and uncertainty. And even the smallest sounds seemed to stretch, the faint buzz of the lights above, the distant hum of a camera drone hovering somewhere beyond the outfield, the soft shift of fabric as Logan Pierce adjusted his stance again, tighter now, more controlled, his earlier confidence reshaped into focus, his eyes locked on Malik with a seriousness that had not been there before. And behind the plate the catcher hesitated for just a fraction of a second before setting his glove, this time centered, not low, not outside, but right over the heart of the plate, as if testing whether Malik would play it safe, whether he would choose certainty over challenge. And that small decision hung in the air between them, a silent question that did not need words. And Malik saw it clearly, understood it instantly, and for a brief moment his gaze dropped again, not in doubt, but in reflection, the memory of a smaller field returning, the uneven dirt, the dim glow of a single light, his father standing beside him with hands in his pockets, watching without interference, and the voice that followed was as steady as it had always been. When they expect simple, give them something they cannot read. And Malik exhaled slowly, the air leaving his chest in a controlled release that settled everything inside him. And when he looked up again, the stadium returned, but the pressure did not, because he was no longer standing inside their expectations, he was standing inside his own rhythm. And he stepped into his motion, smooth, balanced, every movement connected, his arm coming forward with the same quiet precision. But the grip had changed, subtle, intentional, and the ball left his hand with a different spin, not visible to the crowd, not obvious to the eye, but enough to alter its path. And Logan tracked it immediately, his focus sharp, his timing ready, because this pitch came straight, centered, exactly where a hitter wanted it. And that was the invitation. That was the test. And Logan committed, his swing coming forward, with confidence, clean, powerful, the kind of swing that usually connected, that usually sent the ball deep into the outfield. But the ball did not stay true, not all the way, because in the final stretch it dropped, just enough, just late enough, slipping beneath the arc of the bat by inches that felt like miles. and the swing cut through nothing again, the air splitting cleanly, and the sound that followed was that same sharp, undeniable pop as the catcher secured it firmly, glove snapping. Shut around certainty, and for a moment there was no sound at all, not even murmurs, not even breath, just stillness, complete and absolute, as if the entire stadium needed a second to understand what had just happened. And then the umpire's voice came, steady and final, strike 3. And the words did not echo because they did not need to. They landed exactly where they were supposed to. And Logan Pierce remained frozen for a fraction of a second longer than expected, his bat still extended, eyes fixed on the space where the ball had been, not in disbelief but in recalibration, because this was not something he had planned for. And in the stands the silence broke, not into laughter, not into immediate cheers, but into something more complex, a rising wave of recognition, of realization, voices overlapping, questions forming, reactions building, and Coach Whitaker did not move right away. His eyes locked on Malik with a focus that had completely replaced the dismissal from earlier. His posture no longer guarded but open, as if something in him had shifted without permission, and Malik stepped back off the mound, calm, composed, his breathing steady, his face unchanged, because to him this was not a moment of triumph. It was the completion of something he had already believed, and he did not look to the crowd, did not search for approval. He simply adjusted the glove in his hand and let the silence and the sound that followed belong to everyone else, because he had already done what he came to do. The sound came first, not loud but rising, a low swell of voices building into something that no longer questioned what had happened but reacted to it. And Malik Johnson stood just off the mound as the noise caught up to the moment, a delayed recognition spreading across the stadium like a wave that had taken too long to form. And he did not turn toward it, did not lift his head to meet it, because his focus had already moved forward, already settled into the quiet space that followed execution. And behind him the catcher removed his mask slowly, eyes still fixed on Malik with a look that carried more respect than confusion now, as if something had been proven without needing explanation, and Logan Pierce stepped back from the plate, adjusting his grip again. But this time, there was no casual reset, no easy confidence returning, just a measured breath and a glance toward the mound that lingered a second longer than before, acknowledging without words that the moment had shifted in a way he could not ignore. And near the dugout Coach Daniel Whitaker finally moved, one step forward, then another, his posture no longer rigid but active, his eyes locked on Malik with an intensity that had replaced every earlier doubt, and he raised a hand slightly, not to stop anything, but to pause the field just long enough to process what had just unfolded, and the umpire stepped aside, giving space without needing instruction, because even he understood that this was no longer routine, and Malik turned then, just slightly, enough to face the coach, his expression steady, not expectant, not demanding, just present, and for a brief moment the two stood in a line of sight that carried more than words. The distance between them filled with everything that had been assumed and everything that had just been undone, and Coach Whitaker exhaled slowly, his hand dropping to his side, his voice quieter than before, but carrying further. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, and it was not a challenge, not a dismissal. It was a question that acknowledged what he had seen without fully understanding it, and Malik answered, without hesitation, "From my dad, sir," he said, his tone even, respectful, and something in that answer shifted the air again, subtle but real, because it grounded the moment in something human, something beyond the field, and the coach nodded once, slowly, absorbing it. And for the first time since Malik had spoken, there was no barrier in his expression, no distance, just consideration, and he looked out toward the field, then back at Malik, and the decision formed not as a reaction, but as a realization, and he stepped closer, closing the space between them, and the stadium quieted again, not completely but enough to listen, enough to feel that something else was about to happen, and Coach Whitaker reached into his pocket and pulled out the lineup card, the paper slightly creased, edges worn from handling, and he looked down at it for a second, then back up, and with a motion that was simple but unmistakable, he extended it toward Malik, not as a symbol, not as a gesture for the crowd, but as a practical shift, a place being made where there had not been one before, and Malik looked at it, then at the coach, and for the first time there was a flicker of something in his eyes, Not surprise, not disbelief, but recognition, and he took it carefully, the paper light in his hand, but carrying weight that could not be measured, and the crowd reacted again, louder now, not in laughter, but in something closer to acknowledgement, a rising sound that filled the stadium in a way that felt different from before, because it was no longer directed at him but shaped around what he had done. And Logan Pierce watched from the plate, his posture straight, his expression composed but changed, and he gave a small nod, barely visible, but enough, and Malik nodded back, just once, a quiet exchange that needed no words, and as the field reset around them, as players shifted back into position and the game prepared to continue, Malik stepped toward the dugout with the same steady pace he had carried from the start, the glove still in his hand, the noise still building behind him, but none of it pulling him off center, because he had not come for the noise, he had not come for the moment, he had come to be seen through what he could do, and now that had happened, and everything else was just what followed. The lineup card felt lighter than it should have in Malik Johnson's hand, a thin piece of paper that carried a shift no one in the stadium could ignore, and as he stepped into the dugout the noise followed him, louder now, layered with voices that no longer questioned but reacted, some calling out his name even though they had only learned it seconds ago, others speaking into phones, recording, explaining, trying to capture what had just happened before it slipped into something unreal. And Malik did not rush. He moved with the same steady pace, placing the card carefully on the bench beside him, his glove resting next to it, his fingers brushing the edge of the wood for a brief second as if grounding himself again. And around him the players shifted, a space opening that had not been there before, not forced, not announced, just understood, and one of the infielders glanced at him, then nodded once, subtle but deliberate, an acknowledgement that did not need words, and Malik returned it just as quietly, because this was not about taking space, it was about earning it, and across the field Logan Pierce stepped back into position, rolling his shoulders once more, but now his movements carried a different weight, more measured, more aware, his earlier ease replaced by focus that had been sharpened by what he had just faced, and near the dugout coach Daniel Whitaker stood with his hands on his hips, eyes moving between Malik and the field, recalculating not just strategy but understanding, and he turned slightly, addressing the bench without raising his voice. "Stay ready," he said, but his eyes lingered on Malik a fraction longer, and that pause carried more meaning than the words themselves. And Malik heard it, felt it, but did not react outwardly, because readiness had never been something he waited for someone else to grant. It had always been something he carried with him. And the game resumed, the umpire calling players back into motion, the rhythm of the field restarting with a tempo that felt different now, not slower, not faster, but more deliberate, as if every movement had gained weight. And Malik sat forward on the bench, elbows resting lightly on his knees, watching, absorbing, not as an outsider anymore, but as part of the unfolding moment, and the sounds of the game returned. The sharp crack of a bat meeting a pitch, the quick calls between players, the steady cadence of feet against dirt, but beneath it all there was something else, a shift in attention that did not leave him, that followed him even as the play moved elsewhere, and in the stands the conversation had changed, the earlier laughter replaced with questions, with speculation, with the kind of curiosity that grows when something breaks expectation, and a scout leaned forward in his seat, pen moving again, this time with purpose, writing not out of habit but interest, and Malik noticed none of it directly. But he felt it, the way the air carried a different kind of weight now, and he adjusted his glove slightly, the leather creaking softly, familiar, grounding, and for a brief moment his gaze drifted toward the outfield lights, bright and constant. And in that glow, he found the same stillness he had carried from the mound, the same quiet that had not changed even when everything else had. And beside him the older man in the maintenance jacket appeared at the edge of the dugout, leaning lightly against the rail, his broom resting beside him, and he did not speak, did not interrupt. He simply gave another small nod, the same as before, steady, knowing, and Malik returned it with the slightest tilt of his head, an exchange that existed outside the noise, outside the attention, and as the inning continued, as the game moved forward with stakes that stretched far beyond the field, Malik remained exactly where he was, present, ready, not chasing the moment that had just passed, and not anticipating the one that might come, because he understood something the stadium was only beginning to realize, that what mattered was not the 3 pitches, not the reaction, not even the opportunity that had just been placed in his hands. What mattered was that he had stepped forward when no one expected him to, and he had not stepped back, and now the game, the crowd, the coach, all of it had adjusted to him, and not the other way around. The inning moved forward, but the balance of it had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, not by routine plays or expected outcomes, because something had already been introduced into the game that did not belong to the script everyone had arrived with. And Malik Johnson felt it without needing to look for it. The way attention lingered even when the ball was no longer in his hand. The way conversations in the stands dipped whenever his name surfaced. The way even the players on the field seemed just a fraction more aware of his presence than before. And he remained seated at the edge of the dugout, elbows resting lightly on his knees, posture relaxed but ready, his glove turning slowly in his hands as his fingers traced the seams again, not out of nervous habit, but out of connection, grounding himself in something constant while everything around him adjusted. And on the field, Logan Pierce returned to the batter's box later in the inning, his steps measured, his shoulders squared with a focus that had replaced every trace of casual confidence. And this time when he settled in, he did not glance toward the crowd, did not shift his weight unnecessarily. He locked in, eyes sharp, as if acknowledging that the game now demanded something different from him. And the pitcher facing him was not Malik, but the comparison was there anyway, lingering in the air, influencing every movement. And when the pitch came, Logan connected, clean and solid, sending the ball into the outfield with a controlled swing that drew a quick reaction from the crowd, a release of energy that had been building. And as he reached first base, he did not celebrate. He simply adjusted his gloves and looked briefly toward the dugout where Malik sat. And that glance, short and subtle, carried respect more than anything else. And Malik met it with the slightest nod, not claiming anything, not asserting anything, just acknowledging the shared understanding that had formed between them in less than a minute. And near the dugout, coach Daniel Whitaker watched both of them closely, his expression thoughtful now, his earlier certainty replaced with something quieter, something more deliberate. And he stepped back toward the bench, standing just behind Malik for a moment without speaking, his presence there enough to be noticed but not announced. And after a few seconds he said, "You stay ready. You hear me?" His voice low, directed but not commanding, and Malik nodded once. "Yes, sir," he answered, and that exchange, simple as it was, carried a shift in tone that did not need explanation, because readiness was no longer hypothetical, it was expected, and the game continued, plays unfolding with the steady rhythm that defined it. But the weight of each moment felt different now, more precise, as if every action had to account for what had already happened. And in the stands the conversations grew more focused, scouts leaning in closer, phones raised again, but this time with intent, not for entertainment, but for record, capturing a possibility that had not existed before. And the older man in the maintenance jacket remained near the edge of the dugout, his broom resting lightly against the rail, his eyes following the game with a quiet attentiveness that mirrored Malik's own. And every so often he would glance toward Malik, not checking, not questioning, just present. And Malik felt that presence the same way he felt the field, as something steady, something that did not shift with noise or attention. And as the inning neared its end, the scoreboard flickered again, numbers updating, the stakes of the game pressing forward. But the meaning of those numbers had changed, because now they were part of a larger story that no one had expected to tell. And Malik rose slowly from the bench as the final out of the inning approached, not because he had been called, but because he understood the rhythm, understood that moments did not wait to be announced. They arrived when preparation met opportunity. And he stepped closer to the edge of the dugout, glove in hand, eyes on the field, his posture calm but engaged. And when the out was made and the teams began to shift sides, the transition felt different, heavier with possibility, and Coach Whitaker turned slightly, looking at Malik again, not as an afterthought, not as a risk, but as a factor. And Malik held that gaze for a brief second before looking back to the field, because he did not need to hold it longer than that. The understanding was already there, and as he stepped forward with the team, the noise rising again around them, it no longer felt like something he had to push through. It felt like something that had adjusted to him, and the game, still the same in structure, had become something else entirely in meaning. The transition between innings carried a different kind of weight now, not just the routine shift of players moving on and off the field, but a quiet tension that lingered in the space between expectation and possibility, and Malik Johnson stepped out from the dugout with the rest of the team, his pace steady, his posture unchanged, yet everything around him had subtly adjusted, the field no longer indifferent to his presence, but aware of it. And as he crossed the foul line, the dirt beneath his cleats felt the same, firm and familiar, but the air above it carried something new, something charged, and Coach Daniel Whitaker walked a few steps ahead before slowing just enough for Malik to come alongside him. Not fully turning, not making it a moment for others to notice, but enough to speak without distance. "You ever pitched more than that?" he asked quietly, his tone even but no longer dismissive, and Malik answered just as simply, "Yes, sir." And there was no elaboration, no need to explain where or when, because the answer itself was enough, and the coach nodded once, a small movement that carried more decision than it showed, and he stepped forward again, raising his voice just slightly as he addressed the infield, calling out adjustments, positioning, routine commands that sounded the same but felt different, because now they included Malik in a way that had not been planned, and the players responded, shifting into place, glancing briefly toward Malik as they settled, not questioning, not resisting, just recalibrating. And across the diamond, Logan Pierce took his position again, his stance composed, his focus sharpened, and when his eyes met Malik's for a brief second, there was no trace of earlier assumption, only recognition, and the stadium, still alive with sound, seemed to carry a quieter layer beneath it, a current of anticipation that did not erupt, but held steady, as if everyone understood that the next moment might matter more than the last, and Malik reached the mound again, stepping onto it with the same controlled movement, his foot finding the rubber without hesitation, his glove resting lightly against his palm, and he looked out toward home plate, the distance unchanged, the target waiting, and for a second everything slowed, not in time but in perception, the edges of the field sharpening, the sounds narrowing, and he brought his hands together once more, the soft contact of leather and ball grounding him. And behind the plate the catcher crouched lower this time, no hesitation, gloves set with intent, and the umpire leaned in, ready, and the crowd leaned forward again, not with laughter now, but with something closer to belief, not fully formed but present, and Malik inhaled slowly, the air steady in his chest, and as he exhaled he began his motion, smooth, deliberate, his arm moving forward with the same quiet precision that had defined him from the start. And the ball left his hand cleanly, spinning with intent, cutting through the air toward the plate. And this time there was no underestimation waiting to meet it, no casual swing, because Logan was ready, his eyes locked in, his timing sharp, and he swung with purpose, connecting solidly, sending the ball into play with a crisp sound that broke the tension, and the field reacted instantly, players moving, feet digging into dirt, gloves rising, the rhythm of the game reasserting itself, and Malik stepped off the mound, turning slightly to track the play, his expression unchanged, his focus intact, because this was not about perfection, it was about presence, and the ball was fielded cleanly, the play executed with efficiency, and as the out was made the crowd responded with a different kind of energy, not explosive but appreciative, recognizing the level of play that had just unfolded, and Malik walked back toward the mound, retrieving the ball as it was tossed back to him, his grip settling around it naturally, and as he looked up again, scanning the field, the shift was complete, not in score, not in outcome, but in perception, because he was no longer the interruption, no longer the unexpected voice, he was part of the game now, fully, undeniably, and everything that followed would have to account for that. The ball settled back into Malik Johnson's hand, and for a brief moment everything aligned into something simple again. Just leather against skin, seams against fingertips, breath steady in his chest, but the simplicity did not erase the weight, it clarified it, because now the game had moved beyond the question of whether he belonged, and into something far more demanding, whether he could sustain it. And as he stepped back onto the rubber the field felt sharper, more defined, every player locked into position with a focus that had been earned, not assumed, and Coach Daniel Whitaker stood near the edge of the infield, arms relaxed at his sides, no longer closed off, his attention fixed entirely on Malik in a way that carried expectation without pressure, and that difference mattered, and Malik felt it, not as a burden but as a shift in trust, and he looked toward the plate again. The catcher already set, glove firm, target clear, and the crowd, though still loud, held a different tone now, less scattered, more unified, as if the thousands of voices had settled into a shared understanding that this moment required attention, not noise, and Malik brought his hands together once more, the familiar contact grounding him, and as he inhaled he allowed the rhythm to return, not forcing it, not chasing it, just letting it settle into place, and when he moved it was with the same controlled precision, his arm following through cleanly, the ball leaving his hand with intent that did not need to be seen to be understood, and the pitch came in tight, fast but not rushed, cutting toward the inside edge, and the batter reacted quickly, making contact, sending the ball toward the infield where it was fielded cleanly, the play unfolding with practiced efficiency, and the out was made, and the stadium responded with a quick rise of sound, appreciative, recognizing the flow of the game now fully engaged, and Malik turned slightly, retrieving the ball again as it was tossed back to him, his movements steady, unhurried, and as he reset for the next pitch he became aware of something that had not been there before, not pressure, not doubt, but attention that stayed with him even between plays, a presence that did not fade when the ball left his hand, and in the stands a scout leaned forward again, speaking quietly into a recorder, capturing observations that would carry beyond this field, beyond this game. And Malik did not hear the words, but he felt the shift they represented, the extension of this moment into something larger, and he stepped back into position, setting his feet once more, the dirt firm beneath him, and for a second his gaze drifted toward the dugout where the lineup card still rested on the bench, a small detail but a real one, a confirmation that what had happened was not temporary, and he looked back to the plate, refocusing, because the game did not pause for recognition, it moved forward, and he had to move with it, and the next pitch came, smooth, deliberate, the ball traveling with quiet purpose, and the batter watched it closely, choosing not to swing, and the catcher secured it cleanly, the umpire's voice calling the strike with the same steady authority, and the count shifted, the situation tightening, and Malik remained composed, his breathing even, his posture unchanged, because this was where consistency mattered, not in the highlight but in the continuation, and across the field Logan Pierce watched from his position, arms resting lightly at his sides, his eyes following Malik with a focus that no longer questioned but studied, and Coach Whitaker shifted slightly, stepping closer to the mound but stopping short, not intervening, just present, and Malik felt that presence without turning, understanding that it was not there to control but to witness, and he brought his hands together again, preparing for the next pitch, the rhythm steady, the moment clear, and as he began his motion the stadium leaned in once more, not because they doubted him, but because they had begun to believe, and belief carried its own kind of weight, one that did not push down but held steady, and Malik moved through it the same way he had moved through everything else, with control, with clarity, and with the quiet certainty that had brought him here in the first place. The count tightened and the field seemed to draw inward around it, not physically but in focus. Every player aware that the next pitch would not just move the inning forward, but define the rhythm that Malik Johnson had built since stepping onto the mound. And he stood there with the ball resting calmly in his hand, fingers aligned along the seams, his breathing steady, shoulders relaxed, and for a moment everything felt quiet again. Not because the stadium had gone silent, but because his attention had narrowed, filtering out everything that did not belong to the space between him and the plate. And behind it the catcher adjusted slightly, glove shifting just an inch higher, signaling something subtle, something precise, and Malik saw it immediately, understanding the intention without needing to question it. And he nodded almost imperceptibly, not for the catcher, not for the coach, but for himself, confirming the decision before the motion even began, and Coach Daniel Whitaker stood just off to the side, watching closely now, not with skepticism, but with a kind of measured respect, his earlier authority reshaped into observation, and that shift carried weight, because it meant Malik was no longer being evaluated as a risk, but as a factor in the outcome. And across the field, Logan Pierce leaned slightly forward from his position, his eyes locked on the mound, his posture reflecting a level of engagement that had replaced any distance between them, and the crowd, though still present in sound, held back just enough, as if understanding that interruption would break something that had taken time to build. And Malik brought his hands together once more, glove and ball meeting with that same quiet, familiar contact, and he inhaled slowly, the air filling his chest with a calm that did not depend on the moment but existed within him regardless of it. And when he exhaled, he moved, his motion smooth, connected, his arm coming forward with controlled precision, and the ball left his hand cleanly, spinning with intent that carried it toward the upper edge of the strike zone, a tighter target, a risk that required confidence. And the batter tracked it carefully, his eyes following the trajectory, his body prepared to react, but he hesitated just enough, unsure whether it would hold its line or rise beyond reach. And that hesitation became the difference, because the ball settled exactly where it needed to, clipping the edge of the zone with a sharp, undeniable path, and the catcher received it cleanly, gloves snapping shut with a sound that cut through the tension, and the umpire's voice followed immediately, firm and clear, strike. And the call carried a finality that did not need repetition, and the count resolved into something decisive, and the batter stepped back, resetting. But the momentum had already shifted, and Malik stepped off the mound briefly, rolling the ball once in his hand, not in uncertainty but in rhythm. And as he looked up again, the field seemed more aligned, more connected, as if each movement now carried purpose instead of reaction. And Coach Whitaker took a step closer, not interrupting, just present, his eyes meeting Malik's for a fraction of a second, and in that look there was no longer distance, no longer doubt, just acknowledgement. And Malik nodded slightly, then turned back to the plate, because the moment did not end with recognition. It continued with responsibility, and he stepped back onto the rubber, setting his feet, grounding himself once more, and the crowd leaned in again, not with anticipation of spectacle, but with trust in what had already been shown. And Malik brought his hands together again, preparing for the next pitch, his focus unchanged, his posture steady, and as he began his motion, the stadium seemed to hold itself just a little quieter, not out of doubt, but out of respect for the precision unfolding in front of them. And Malik moved through it with the same calm certainty, not trying to prove anything further, not chasing validation, but simply continuing, pitch by pitch, moment by moment, in a rhythm that no longer needed to be questioned because it had already been established. The field settled into a stillness that felt earned rather than forced, the kind that comes only after tension has been tested and held. And Malik Johnson stood on the mound with the ball resting lightly in his hand, the seams aligned beneath his fingers as if they had always belonged there. And for a brief moment everything slowed again, not the game itself but the way it was perceived, the edges of movement sharpening, the sounds narrowing into something distant and controlled. And he looked toward the plate where the catcher waited, glove set with quiet certainty, no hesitation left in the signal, no doubt in the target. And Malik understood that this pitch was not about proving anything new. It was about completing what had already been built. And he brought his hands together once more, the soft contact grounding him in the same rhythm that had carried him through every moment so far. And as he inhaled, the air felt steady, unchanged, and as he exhaled, he allowed the motion to begin, smooth, connected, his body moving as one continuous line of intent. And the ball left his hand cleanly, spinning with purpose, traveling toward the plate with a quiet precision that did not need force to carry it. And the batter reacted, his focus sharp, his swing prepared. But there was a fraction of hesitation still lingering, a trace of uncertainty that had been introduced earlier and had not fully left. And that fraction was enough, because the ball held its path just long enough to invite commitment, and then shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to the untrained eye, but enough to move beyond the center of expectation, and the swing passed through air again, close but not connected. And the sound that followed was the sharp, definitive snap of the catcher's glove closing around the pitch. And for a second the entire stadium seemed to stop, not in silence, but in suspension, as if the moment needed to settle before it could be understood. And then the umpire's voice came, clear and final, strike. And the word carried more than a count. It carried conclusion, and the inning closed around it. The final out secured not through spectacle, but through consistency, through control, through a sequence that had begun with doubt and ended with certainty. And Malik stepped back from the mound slowly, not rushing, not reacting outwardly, his posture the same as it had been from the beginning. Calm, steady, grounded. And as the field shifted around him, players moving, the crowd rising into a fuller sound now, something closer to appreciation than surprise, he allowed none of it to pull him away from that center, because for him the moment had already resolved, and Coach Daniel Whitaker stood just off the infield, watching, his expression no longer guarded, no longer uncertain, but open in a way that acknowledged what had just been done without needing to say it. And as Malik walked toward the dugout, their eyes met briefly. And in that exchange there was no hierarchy, no distance, just recognition. And the coach gave a small nod, subtle but deliberate, and Malik returned it with the same quiet acknowledgement. And across the field Logan Pierce stood near the baseline, his hands resting at his sides, his gaze following Malik for a moment before he nodded once as well. A gesture that carried respect earned in seconds, but grounded in understanding. And the crowd continued to rise, voices layering into a unified sound that filled the stadium in a way that felt different from before, not reactive but responsive. And Malik stepped into the dugout with the same measured pace, placing his glove back on the bench, his fingers releasing the ball slowly, as if returning it to something larger than himself. And he sat down without ceremony, elbows resting lightly on his knees, breathing steady, because the moment did not require celebration, it required completion. And as the game prepared to move forward again, as the scoreboard updated and the next inning loomed, the shift that had taken place remained, not in numbers, not in statistics, but in perception, in understanding, in the quiet recognition that something real had been revealed. And Malik remained exactly where he was, present, grounded, unchanged by the noise, because he had not stepped onto the field to change the world. He had stepped onto it to be true to what he already knew, and that had been enough. The game moved on, but the moment did not leave. It settled into the edges of everything that followed, into the way players carried themselves, into the way the crowd held its attention even between pitches, into the quiet space inside Malik Johnson that had never depended on any of it to begin with. And he sat on the bench with his glove resting beside him, fingers loosely interlaced, breathing even, watching the field with the same steady focus he had brought to the mound. And around him the dugout no longer felt like a place he had stepped into, but a place that had adjusted to include him. Conversations shifting without pause, players moving around him without hesitation, as if the question of whether he belonged had been answered without needing to be asked again. And Coach Daniel Whitaker stood at the edge of the dugout, one hand resting lightly against the rail, his posture relaxed in a way that had not been there before. And every so often his eyes would move toward Malik, not checking, not evaluating, just acknowledging. And that quiet acknowledgement carried more weight than any words could have. And across the field Logan Pierce stepped back into position once more, his movements composed, his focus sharp, and when he glanced toward the dugout his gaze found Malik again, and this time there was no distance in it, no separation of roles or expectations, just recognition between two players who had met in a moment that did not need to be repeated to be understood. And Malik returned the glance with a slight nod, the same calm exchange that had defined everything between them, and the stadium, still alive with sound, held a different kind of energy now. Not the scattered noise of earlier, but something more unified, more grounded, as if the crowd itself had been reshaped by what it had witnessed, and the lights above continued to burn bright and constant, casting long shadows across the field, shadows that moved with the players but never obscured them. And Malik watched as the inning unfolded, plays executed, calls made, the rhythm of the game continuing without interruption. And yet everything felt connected to that brief sequence that had changed the tone of the entire night. And beside him the older man in the maintenance jacket remained near the edge of the dugout, his broom resting quietly against the rail, his presence unchanged, steady. And he glanced at Malik once more, offering that same small nod. And Malik returned it again, because some things did not need to evolve, they only needed to remain true. And as the game progressed toward its later moments the scoreboard updated, numbers shifting, the stakes of the game, pressing forward in ways that mattered to everyone else. But for Malik, those numbers existed alongside something else, something quieter, something more lasting. And when Coach Whitaker finally stepped closer, stopping just beside him, his voice low but clear, "You did not just change this game," he said, not looking directly at Malik, but speaking in a way that did not need eye contact to be understood. "You changed how they see it." And Malik listened, his expression unchanged, his posture steady, and after a brief pause he answered simply, "I just threw the ball, sir." And the honesty in that response settled into the space between them, grounding the moment in something real, and the coach nodded once, a small, thoughtful movement, as if recognizing that what had happened could not be reduced to explanation, and he stepped away again, returning to the rhythm of the game, and Malik remained where he was, present, centered, his gaze returning to the field. And as the final moments of the game approached, as the crowd rose once more and the sounds layered into something full and complete, Malik did not stand, did not seek the moment. He simply watched, because he understood something that could not be announced or measured, that what mattered had already happened, and it would remain long after the scoreboard cleared, long after the lights dimmed, long after the crowd went home. And as the final play was made and the game concluded, the sound that followed filled the stadium. But Malik remained still for a second longer, breathing steady, grounded in the same quiet that had carried him from the beginning. And when he finally stood, lifting his glove from the bench, he did so without urgency, without display, just a simple motion that carried him forward. And as he stepped out of the dugout and onto the field once more, the lights reflecting softly off the surface of the grass, there was no need for anything more, because he had not come to be louder than the crowd. He had come to be true within himself, and in doing so, he had made something else true for everyone watching, something they would carry long after the game was over, even if they could not fully explain it. And Malik walked forward with the same steady pace, the same quiet presence, and the night closed around him not with an ending, but with a sense of something completed, something understood, something that did not need to be said out loud to be remembered.